Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm your host, Alec McDonald.
And I'm Ting Ye.
Hi, I'm Chris Horton. I'm a Taiwan-based journalist, and I'm here to talk today about my book, Ghost Nation.
Taiwan's struggle for survival has spanned centuries of colonialism, a story of violence and perseverance, and now one that is facing threat of invasion which could erase it all. Chris Horton's new book, Ghost Nation, covers this story.
So Chris, we are super excited to have you with us because Alec and we both read your book and we really loved it. So we have a bunch of questions that we can't wait to talk about. So first of all, we have to ask, because your book is called Ghost Nation, and there's an idiom in Mandarin, it's called Gui Dao. It means ghost island. So as a local Taiwanese, that means that there's some negative emotions related to some current social issues right now in Taiwan. So why did you name your book Ghost Nation, and what does Ghost Nation mean to you?
Well, originally it was going to be called Ghost Island. It was a term that the Japanese used because you came over here back then, prior to colonization. There were diseases invisible diseases that would kill people, and also as an outsider, maybe arriving in Taiwan, there were already indigenous people here, and maybe they weren't really looking for people to come and live on their land. So it was it was less welcoming than it is today. But I also, the title Ghost Island didn't make sense because we wanted to have something that in my book I call it a country. Taiwan is a country. In the book we talk about how international media, a lot of it refuses to call Taiwan a country. It calls it the island, the self-ruled island, the democratic island. So my editors were like, maybe we should call it Ghost Nation, and it was a pretty convincing argument. So, but in terms of why I used Ghost Nation or just the ghost theme, Taiwan, it's kind of invisible to the rest of the world because of its diplomatic situation. And I wanted to highlight this super important country that not only is it important to democracy and it's a bulwark against authoritarianism, but also, from a semiconductor standpoint, it's kind of present everywhere, even if it's invisible, everywhere in the world. And lastly, there's also, I guess, using a more modern usage of the word ghost, the verb to ghost or to be ghosted. Taiwan has been ghosted by the world, but especially by democracies who should be embracing and standing up for one of their own.
You started your first chapter about the ceremony that was held in 2016. The Taiwan Presidential Office building, where then President Tsai Ing-wen, she's apologizing to the indigenous people of Taiwanese on behalf of Taiwan's government.
400年来，每一个曾经来到台湾的政权，透过武力征伐、土地掠夺，强烈侵害了原住民族既有的权利。为此，我代表政府向原住民族道歉。
Why do you think Taiwanese indigenous history is very important, and so you use it as the beginning of your chapter?
Well, I mean, they're the original inhabitants of Taiwan, so that makes them important just for that. But also, they've influenced Taiwan's culture quite a bit, and they're still a big part of it today. The language, the food, so much of Taiwan is influenced by its indigenous people. But also, they're living proof that Taiwan's not historically Chinese. No matter what people say, there was nobody here from the outside world until 400 years ago. It's a big part of Taiwanese identity, I think, and I wanted to start and end the book with indigenous Taiwanese themes.
So, are those chapters, do you think, the most important that somebody who may be reading Taiwan a lot in the news, but they don't know a lot about Taiwan's history?
Taiwan's been through so much, and it hasn't always been a country. It wasn't even a single unified administrative unit until Japan came, and it took 20 years of war against indigenous Taiwanese to really bring all of Taiwan under control. So I think in terms of history that maybe people, even including Taiwanese people, just because of for textbook reasons here. People don't know too much about Taiwan. The Japanese period, that's 50 years of colonization, and it was very formative for Taiwan's identity. And I think, once you get from Japan to the arrival of the Kuomintang in 1945, and this is a problem that we have in international media. You have 800 words, 1,000 words to write a story about something happening in Taiwan. And most people, if they're going to talk anything about Taiwan's history, they're going to start with the 1940s. But that's really, kind of cutting things off very, very late in Taiwan's history. The Japanese era was very formative, and I think it deserves a lot more consideration. I think presenting Taiwan as this place that maybe rose up out of the sea in the 1940s, and then the KMT fled here from the Chinese Civil War. That's almost how it feels like it's presented.
So from your observation, what are those most common misunderstandings you found that people out of Taiwan have about the Taiwan Strait conflicts?
Well, I think one of the big kind of misleading tropes that you have in international media today is, in 1949, Taiwan and the mainland split. And, just using that term mainland, it implies that Taiwan completes China. And, historically, that's just never been the case. Taiwan was ignored by China until the very late, until the Qing dynasty. And the Qing dynasty was, it wasn't a Han Chinese dynasty, it was Manchu. So you've really only had 4 years in all of, human history that a China-based government has controlled all of Taiwan. And that was 1945 to 1949. And during that time, you had a major uprising by Taiwanese against Chinese rule in 1947 that was put down with serious violence, with tens of thousands of deaths. So I think it's because people know so little about Taiwan. It's really hard to say like where the biggest misunderstanding is. It's hence the Ghost Nation title again. It's this place everybody knows it exists, but nobody really sees it, and nobody understands it.
But recently, we feel like some of the ways and terms that the international media referring to Taiwan is like slightly changing into a new kind of version. What kind of the role that the international media is holding while like shaping or maybe distorting those kind of like misleading informations about Taiwan?
I think the biggest thing is there aren't really any international media editors based in Taiwan. And if none of them are here, it's hard for them to understand it, But there's a lot more reporters. There are a lot more reporters who are based here. And that has definitely improved coverage, but they still have to get things past their editors. But 10 years ago when I first got here, you had most of the international media coverage of Taiwan being written from Hong Kong or Beijing or Shanghai. So in the last 10 years, there's been a great improvement in terms of the breadth and depth of coverage of Taiwan. So that's positive, and hopefully it will continue.
What did you think that it's actually causing the change that you just mentioned?
It really started with 2020. A lot of journalists that had been based in China, especially in Beijing, got kicked out by the government of China, and many of them landed here. So from major publications in the US and elsewhere in the world. And then because of COVID, you had a lot of reporters that wanted to get a visa and go into China, but it was too difficult, and so they came here instead. And they were still covering China, but they're here and they're seeing these stories and they're pitching them to their editors. Having people, feet on the ground really has changed things.
When you came to Taiwan like 10 years ago, what's the most surprised thing that you found out in Taiwan that was different from your imagination or expectation?
I would say the Japanese influence. That was something that I found quite deep, and it. Even though people were renting an apartment, you talk about the size of the apartment in terms of not square feet or square meters, but in terms of ping. And a ping, if I'm not mistaken, is the size of 2 tatami mats. Yeah. And that kind of blew my mind when I first got here. And baseball is another good example. I assumed that that Americans had introduced baseball kind of during the Cold War, but it was Japanese. And yeah, it's I think the Japanese influence is one of the least appreciated aspects of Taiwan from an international perspective.
And I think that history aspect is really, really important and a really strong feature of your book as well, because you contrast that as well with kind of the Chinese narrative, and you introduce that in the prologue. And it's something that Taiwan is also going through itself with reform in the history curriculum inside, all levels of education. When you were going through and selecting the stories and kind of the historiography of the book, what was that process like, and what were the challenges you faced?
I think the main issue that I had was there was just too many stories that were unknown to the outside world, and so there are a lot that didn't make it into the book. You can only fit so much into 300 pages, and like if you're writing a book about China or the United States or Japan, like most international readers, they have some, they kind of have the bullet points already. They understand, but most people might not realize that the first schools in Taiwan, the written language that they taught, the written script that they taught was the Roman alphabet. It wasn't Chinese, because it was the first schools were founded by the Dutch. Most people don't realize that Mandarin wasn't spoken here, widely until 1945, and so you can't just tell people this. You have to explain why, and so there's a lot of explanation. A lot that has to be done, and and you have to be fair, and there's a lot of different groups with different interests, and while you might disagree or find what one group did, you might have certain feelings about that. You have to put yourself in their shoes. It requires a lot of empathy, I suppose.
Since your book stops at around 2024 and we are now currently at 2025, is there anything that you would like to add in as a new chapter if you are still writing your book?
Well, actually, yeah, that was an issue. We kind of wrapped up, I think, in March of this year, and then there was the Zelensky meeting in the White House, and that was something that kind of. It felt, it would be. It felt necessary to include in the book, and then we were like, okay, it's done. And then a few days later, TSMC announces it's going to invest $100 billion. Also in the White House, they're going to make a huge investment in the United States. But luckily, things have been kind of quiet since then. So the book still feels pretty up to date, I think, even though there's a lot happening.
Yeah, so we can maybe expect that you will going to have a Ghost Nation 2, maybe in like 2 years later, covering everything that's happening right now.
I don't know about another book. This one was pretty challenging, but I feel good about the end result, and it ended up being the book that I wanted to write, and highlighting. It's not saying these stories are more important than those. I was just trying to address the lack of Taiwan's story, in terms of discussions of Taiwan, because usually everything's been viewed through a Chinese lens, whether it's the Chinese Communist Party's lens or the Chinese Nationalist Party's lens, and Taiwan's been around a lot longer than since the 1940s, and that's really shaped what it is today.
Thank you, Chris, to come to our show today. That was a great conversation, and we can't wait to see you next time.
Thanks for having me on. I had a great time.
Thank you for watching this special episode of Zoom In, Zoom Out.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.
Or leave a comment below.
Until
next time.